Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on industrial hygiene, workplace safety webinar series. We're really glad to have you all here with us this morning. As we get started, we just wanted to let you know a few things about us. First of all, we want to thank our partners. We work really closely with associations and partners to help provide safety information, and we'd like to thank TSSA, MPMA, SCSA, BIA of the Red River Valley, ABC, NRASP, Build Connection, and the Lakes Area Manufacturers Alliance. Thank you to your partnership and helping us provide information about safety resources. OACS, we are a total safety solution. So we provide health and safety consulting services for small and mid-sized manufacturers and construction companies. We are here for you 24/7, 365 days. Our goal is to help employees get home safely at the end of every day. You can see here on the screen, we have our Twin Cities corporate office information, and we also have an office in Fargo. So please reach out to us if you have any questions, if you need any support, we're here to help. This webinar is really meant to help you guys have information, but we want to answer your questions. So please use the chat to enter any questions as we go along. I will be moderating that chat and interrupting as needed if we have questions that pertain to what they're talking about. And then we will have time at the end for questions as well. We do not share this PowerPoint presentation, so we will not be sending this particular presentation out. However, our webinar will be on our website, easily to find, and you can rewatch it through that, share that YouTube link. So it will be available in the full recording to share with your fellow coworkers or someone you think might find it interesting. We have learning outcomes for this webinar. So in this webinar, you'll be able to define industrial hygiene and its role in occupational health, identify common workplace hazards, understand basic methods of hazard evaluation and control, recognize the importance of exposure limits and monitoring, and become familiar with regulatory frameworks and best practices. We are approved for continuing education units for this webinar. This has been approved for 0.1 CEUs. And after this webinar, you will be receiving a link for the assessment and the evaluation. If you need a CEU, please do both the assessment and the evaluation, and then we will be able to get you a certificate of completion with that information. If you have any questions, please let me know. My name is Jennifer Erickson, and my email is there, jennifer@oecscomply.com. If you have any questions, otherwise you'll be seeing an email from me and my CEU team here later this week about the continuing education units that are available to you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers, Chris and Donna, as they lead us in this discussion on industrial hygiene.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Morning.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining Chris and I for this chat today. As Jennifer said, I'm Donna Hetland. I am the Regional Industrial Hygiene Lead for the Dakotas region. I also provide safety services and anywhere I can help with industrial hygiene. So thank you again for joining us. Hopefully you take something away. Chris?
And I'm Chris Rogie. I'm a safety associate. I've been with the company for about 1.5 years now. I've got some prior roles in the military and some various health, safety, and industrial hygiene roles in the private sector, including Best Buy and Northwest Airlines. Thank you for joining us.
Jennifer, thank you. As you know, you've joined and signed up for a webinar that is related to industrial hygiene. So if you're new to the world of industrial hygiene, you might be wondering what this is. Well, here is the true definition of industrial hygiene. It deals with these 4 different areas: anticipation, recognition, evaluation, and control. And throughout the presentation, Chris and I will give you good examples of how you are able to anticipate, recognize, and then evaluate and control any of these areas to make sure that your employees aren't subject to illness and disease in the workplace. This is that healthful workplace piece that we talk about. Jennifer? So the science and art of anticipating, recognizing, evaluating, and control. So you'll notice that it's kind of a cycle motion here. And so what this has to do with is, because you have certain processes at your place of business, you are going to anticipate that there might be certain hazards involved because of those processes. All processes like welding, paint booths, silica work, blast booths, dip tanks, any of that kind of stuff could be buzzwords here. So because you have those kind of processes at your place of business, you are going to start evaluating and recognizing what kind of hazards you might have. And then outcomes from that are going to be, how do you best control those? What can you implement for controls? And then the cycle motion here indicates that you are going to continuously assess the effectiveness of those controls. So again, Chris and I will give you some good ideas of how you can evaluate and control some of the said hazards under the umbrella of industrial hygiene. Jennifer. You'll notice today that the presentation is broken up into 4 different areas, or 4 different quadrants, Chris and I call it, under the health hazards umbrella. We're going to talk a little bit about chemical hazards, biological hazards, physical hazards, and then round out with ergonomic. We do spend quite a bit of time talking about chemical hazards today, but rest assured you're going to get a little bit of information in each one of these areas. Next slide. So again, for the chemical hazards, this is where I want you to kind of step outside the box or the norm a little bit. When we start talking about chemical hazards, people immediately think about the liquid stuff, the things that can spill. But this is where I'm going to ask you to think a little bit outside of that. When we're dealing with chemical hazards, it has a lot to do with solids, liquids. Could be gases, vapors, dust, mist, fumes. You might recognize terms like hazard communication is a good buzzword here, or toxic and hazardous substances under OSHA, or, let's see, subpart Z has a lot of information for you. So again, thinking outside the box, chemical hazards and controls, we're talking about solids, liquids, gases, vapors, dust, mist, and fumes. Next slide. Now, I'm going to ask you to reach back, dig into your safety data sheet knowledge. And the first thing I'll say is the next few slides that we talk about here have a lot to do with what's on your safety data sheets. So if you're somebody that's joining in today and you think, I haven't really done a good chemical inventory, I don't have all those safety data sheets that I should have, that's going to be some of the first area of work that you want to tackle, because everything that we talk about today under the chemical exposures can directly relate back to the information that is included in your safety data sheets. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So related to safety data sheets, depending on what chemicals or what toxic and hazardous substances you have at your place of business, you are going to recognize that there might be some health hazards that come along with some of those products. Health hazards that are mentioned in section 2 of the safety data sheet could be things like lung damage, kidney damage, toxic and hazardous tissue damage, sterility. Sometimes it's rashes and burns, cancer causers, the list goes on. You also are going to notice in the safety data sheet, depending on what your chemical hazards are, you could still have those physical safety risks like fire, explosion, and corrosion. But again, your roadmap is going to come from those safety data sheets. A lot of times clients will call and ask for mine and Chris's help with industrial hygiene. And the very first thing I ask is, I'm going to need to see safety data sheets on that. Jennifer. Let's talk a little bit about routes of entry. How is any of this, remember we talked about solids, liquids, vapors, fumes. How is all of this stuff going to be able to get into your employees' bodies and cause an issue that could in turn cause an injury or illness or disease? Well, the different routes of entries that we're talking about today are up here on the screen. Let's first talk about inhalation. So hopefully most of you are sitting in a place today where you can take a nice deep breath and it's clean air and there's no exposure. But I know Chris and we've been in different places before, and sometimes when we walk in, we notice a cloud of haze or fume in the air. That makes it a little bit more difficult to get a good, clean breath. What are your employees inhaling that could be floating in the air? Then we talk a little bit about ingestion. In your thinking, wouldn't you think that ingestion has to do with what you're swallowing or maybe what you're eating? Now, we know that employees are smart. Nobody's walking around just taking spoonfuls of whatever chemical you have on the shop floor. But here's something to think about. I trained not too long ago at a company that I set up for training right before lunch. And one of the gentlemen that sat right in front of me went to take a bite of his white bread sandwich. And I was surprised at what was left on the bread. It was his fingerprints. His hands were so dirty with whatever product he had been working with out on his shop floor. That's a great way to ingest. There's other ways of ingestion as well. If there's I don't know, something splashed if somebody maybe was handling a product incorrectly. So lots of different ways that ingestion can happen. Keep in mind, these are all different routes of entry. How is this stuff going to get in? Absorption. Here's something for all of you listening. And usually when I ask this question, I get a couple of chuckles. How many of you have washed your hands in gas or carb cleaner or anything like that? And then my next follow-up question is, why do we do that as human beings? And of course the answer is because a lot of times gas and carb cleaner and brake cleaner and things like that take off whatever junk you want off your hands. So it's easy to do. But what I want you to think about here is we are porous people. And you think about if you wash your hands and that kind of stuff, that's a great route of entry. How's that gasoline going to get down into your bloodstream and cause a problem for you? And the last one that we talk about here is injection. How can an employee become injected by something? A lot of time, this could be pokes and sharps and glass and things like that too, but kind of the main culprit here would be if you've got anything under high pressure. So if you've got a fluid or anything that's liquid that's under high pressure, you think about like forklift hoses. If anything becomes damaged there, and an employee can be injected by whatever that chemical is. So, Jennifer, next screen, please, now that we know a little bit about routes of entry. Potential chemical exposure. Now, these are where you're going to start kind of assessing. You're going to do that recognition piece now, because you might have some of these processes that I talked about. These are some kind of warning signs that you can look for. If you've got those things that are hanging in the air, you've got dust, mist, smoke, this is where I challenge you to maybe do the white glove test. And what I mean by that is go check some of your surfaces. If you have any kind of an accumulation of dust, that is kind of a good indicator that you might need to do some further work. If you have an accumulation of dust, let's say in your break rooms where the employees sit and eat, you might want to take a deeper look at that. If employees complain about tastes or smells, that could be an indicator. But keep in mind, some of the nasty stuff we work with might not even have any kind of a smell, gases, things like that. And then, of course, if your employees are complaining, if their eyes, nose, throat, or if they're coughing or wheezing, or if they've got a rash or something like that on their skin, these are going to be potential warning signs that would tip you off on the recognition piece. And then we've got some work to do. Jennifer. Some of the health hazards that might come along with some of these exposures. Again, we talked a little bit about eyes, nose, throat irritation, lung irritation, if they're coughing or wheezing or just feel a little heaviness in their chest, skin irritation. Have you ever heard your welders talk about flu-like symptoms, almost like a welder flu? It's because of some of these health hazards. Remember the routes of entry. Something is getting into their body. All the way down to memory difficulties, mental confusion. Again, going back to your safety data sheets, there are going to be things in section 2 that tip you off to this. Along the lines of mental confusion, sometimes the safety data sheet lists things like narcotic effects, which means that your employees can, because they've come into contact with something, they can become high almost because of exposure. Jennifer. Let's talk a little bit about health defects. If you're working with certain chemicals or certain toxic and hazardous substances at your place of business, there's a couple of different exposure conditions that I want you to remember. Acute and chronic. Now, acute is pretty much immediate. If they're dealing with a chemical and they feel those effects, they become sick or they can pass out. Usually the exposure is short-term and high concentration of whatever they're dealing with. Where chronic, if somebody is a welder for 30 years at a company, chronic means that it's going to be delayed. They're exposed to different fumes and metals, but they might not notice the health effects until maybe 20, 30 years down the road. So keep in mind acute and chronic, because we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through the presentation. Jennifer. How toxic is it? What are you working with and what are the toxicology properties of this substance? So again, we keep referring to that roadmap for safety data sheets. You might recognize the pictograms that are on the screen. Now we can relate these back to the two terms we just talked about, acute and chronic. If you're dealing with a chemical that has a pictogram on the safety data sheet of the skull and crossbones, what does that mean? Well, to me, that's generally fatal and toxic. Well, how toxic? Well, if it's fatal, that's pretty toxic. That is going to be something that is related to acute toxicity. What about this gentleman in the middle? I call him the exploding chest. Well, make no mistake, though, it's not just lung issues. It's not just something within the chest. This could be related to, and again, in section 2 of the safety data sheet is going to point you to these areas. This can be organ toxicity. Generally, if you see this pictogram, cancer causers, things like that, you are going to notice that this is more of a chronic type of toxicology. And then the last pictogram that we have here, this is one of my favorites. It seems to be kind of one of the most misunderstood in my world. Usually ask employees what this means, and employees usually raise their hand and say, oh, I know what this means, caution or danger. Well, you'd be correct. However, take it a little bit further. This also means that your employees might be sensitive to a product or they might be irritated by this product. What's going to be irritated then if you see this pictogram? Usually this is where you're talking about maybe eyes, nose, throat being irritated or skin may becoming a little bit rashy and itchy. Don't take that one for granted. It is one of the least harmless of our pictograms, but also step your game up a little bit because if employees become sensitive to a product, that can become more of an issue down the road. Jennifer. And here we have Chris to explain
Thanks,
hierarchy of
Donna.
controls. You're welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to be taking over the next segment of slides here. Welcome to the webinar again. We're going to slightly shift back to identifying hazards in the workplace. And when we do that, what we have to have a systematic process in order to evaluate. And then once we have the hazard, take these necessary steps from most effective down to least effective in what's called the hierarchy of controls. And a lot of clients I've had, I've heard a lot of different stories about, hey, clients automatically go to a PPE solution. Well, that really is just putting a Band-Aid on the problem, right? How do we know if we need PPE or in my opinion, the best PPE is no PPE at all. We need to do these other things prior to coming to a solution before we implement PPE. So at the very top, elimination, super important here. This is the best, most effective way to do it. Removing the hazard. And a couple good examples would be, let's say we've got a mezzanine in the workplace. Now we're going to be using it for storage. And in order to remove a fall hazard, let's say we would put up a guardrail system and possibly a mezzanine gate to protect people from falling from heights. Another example, ergonomic wise, removing a lifting hazard. Maybe we use a pallet jack or a dolly of some sort. So those would be a couple examples there. When we get into substitution and replacing the hazard, we've got several options, but maybe we use an oil-based solvent to clean parts, right? Maybe there is a safer alternative, a water-based product that can do just as good of a job as an oil-based product. This goes for other things too. Substituting an old machine, let's say it's a lathe or a drill press or something along those lines that was built many decades ago. We would substitute for a new, more modern piece of equipment that has all the safety guards built in. So just a couple examples there. And then once we've done the elimination part and the substitution, now we're getting into engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE. And I've got some follow-on slides that go a little bit more in depth on that. But engineering is really isolating the people from the hazard, building barriers, keeping people away from the hazardous areas on a particular machine or a particular area in the facility. And then as we get down to least effective, now it's least effective because now with administrative controls and PPE, we introduce the human element, changing the way people work. People wearing PPE, are they wearing it or are they not wearing it? So that's why those two are on the bottom. Is yes, they do some good things, but they're hard to manage. Next slide, please. All right, so engineering controls. This is just a list of few that are available. If we have dusts, vapors, mists, like Donna was talking about, we may want to incorporate some local exhaust ventilation, some general dilution ventilation, where we want to get those contaminants out of the building and away from the workers. Some other things we can do is process and equipment modification. And in this example, we have a hydraulic fracturing process where we replaced transfer belts moving sand with screw augers that greatly reduce the sand and the exposure to silica. So this would be a good example of that. And then isolating and automation. Isolation, I've got a client that was pretty crafty with, they had a noisy machine out on the floor. I believe it was an air compressor. It was creating a lot of noise. And what they did for an engineering control was they hung acoustic paneling, 4x8 sheets. I think they were 2 feet thick, and they hung them from guide wire from the ceiling and completely encapsulated that particular machine, greatly reducing the sound levels out on the floor. And then automation, maybe we're looking at robotics. I've seen some clients shifting towards using robots and automating processes and removing people from that area, and then also isolating it by putting a cage around it. So there are a lot of different things we can do. And again, this is just a few options as far as engineering controls are concerned. Next slide, please. All right, so administrative controls is our next level down. Once we've done the top three, now we're looking at making it more safe by implementing some administrative controls. A few of these are listed on the left side, but there's hundreds of options. We can post signage, develop standard operating procedures, written programs and policies, conducting training. So these are just a few, but again, we're subject to the human element here, even as it pertains to PPE. So once we've done all the administrative controls, now we're at our last resort, which is PPE. Next slide, please.
Chris, before you go on, I have a question that came up about reducing sound when it comes to large sawmill type saws. Do you have any ideas on engineering controls or administrative controls for that type of machine?
I think, yeah, that's a great question. I think if you put up a barrier, some soundproofing materials, I've seen clients where they hang acoustic panels on the walls, which would lower the sound levels, avoid that echoing I've also seen where you put up a clear barrier where you can still see the work that's being accomplished, but you minimize the access to the actual saw itself. So that
Yeah,
would be an
those are
example there.
uh, those are good, Chris. I worked in a facility that had some of those large, noisy saws. You talked about encapsulating or just making sure that they built specific rooms that some of those saws would go in, or hanging the curtains, or sometimes, right? I like the thought process here going through the engineering controls, but then if you're not able to do that the best, then it might be job rotation. It might be only allowing the employees to work in a certain area for just a little bit of time. And I think that'll come up a little bit down the
Right, and
road.
that's something that we could assist with. We could do a site evaluation and determine, going through those hierarchy of controls, what are some alternatives, right? Maybe you think of some, but we might be able to provide some other economical solutions for you.
Yes, perfect.
All right. And then the last level, personal protective equipment. Again, like I said, personal protective equipment, the best type is not to wear it at all, because if we do those other things first and reduce our exposures to hazardous substances in the workplace, we might not have to wear a respirator. But in the event that we are above a regulatory limit, which I'll talk about in the next slide, um, we may be subject to being part of a respirator or respiratory protection program where employees need to wear respirators. Same thing with hearing protection. Um, if we're below and we've done our analysis, employees may still want to wear these on a voluntary basis through an Appendix D. Maybe they still want to wear an N95 mask. And then some other examples here: gloves, safety glasses. Comes down to local policy, different types of clothing that you can wear while working. And again, these are just a few options. Next slide, please. So how do we determine what levels of exposures do we have in the workplace? So we need to do a work site analysis to assess those exposures and to determine what's our baseline. What are we basing it off of? We'll do air monitoring to include personal and area sampling. Let's say you've got some welders, they're exposed to welding fumes. We can sample for that and send that into a lab to determine, hey, am I above a regulatory limit or not? Same thing goes with noise. Are the sound levels in the facility above an action level where we need to maybe implement a hearing conservation program? And then just a few other things here: observing PPE use and work practices. We can also look at ventilation. So if you have engineering controls built in, an exhaust hood or HVAC systems, or even in a paint booth, you can do measurements to determine if the equipment is operating effectively, just by measuring the airflow and making sure that the contaminants are being taken out of the building. And then lastly, wipe samples. You could do lead or mold wipe samples. In fact, I just had a client that has an indoor firing range, and they wanted to do some sampling in the common areas like break rooms, office areas, conference rooms, and just to make sure that the ventilation system in the firing range was working effectively. And luckily, we were sitting really good. It was a new ventilation system with new filters, and it basically came back non-detectable for lead. Slide, please.
Can I add something quick?
Sure.
So that's where people get a little nervous about what they have to do next. They understand that they might have hazards. Jennifer, can you go back a slide, please? They get nervous because they hear us talk about worksite analysis. So Chris and I just want to be able to remind anybody that's listening today, as Jennifer stated when we started, OECS is a total safety solution. So that implies that we can help you with all of these goodies. Chris and I, being industrial hygiene leads, we have different options and resources for getting these assessments done. And most recently, OECS has additional capabilities to minimize cost for you to have these assessment exposures done. So please keep us in mind. By the time Chris and I are finished, we've got our contact information coming up, and you can also check in with your OECS rep if you have one to be able to help tackle this piece of it, just to help minimize some of the nervousness around getting the worksite analysis done. Next slide.
Thanks, Donna.
You're welcome.
All right, so you heard me earlier talk about regulatory limits. There's a number of different type of regulatory limits out there, but the one we really need to focus on is what's called PELs, or permissible exposure limits. And these are the limits that are established by OSHA um, on concentration of substances in the workplace. Are we above an exposure level, or are we below it? And the only way you can do that is doing that worksite analysis. Now, I will say OSHA is not the end all solution here. OSHA may not have a regulatory limit for some of the chemicals that you're working with. If you reference the exposure controls and personal protective section in your SDS, you're going to see some other regulatory bodies in there that maybe NIOSH or ACGIH may have a regulatory limit established that OSHA would adopt, and they would defer to those other bodies, regulatory bodies, when it comes to that. And then the other thing too is we might have a state-run program where Minnesota OSHA may have more stringent exposure limits than when OSHA publishes. So an example of that would be exposure to carbon monoxide in a warehouse, let's say, that has internal combustion engines. The published PEL for carbon monoxide is 50 parts per million for a PEL, but Minnesota OSHA uses subpart Z, and Donna mentioned that earlier, where that limit is at 35 parts per million. So just some other things to consider beyond permissible exposure limits. Slide, please.
Information on permissible exposure limits, Chris, because the next thing I'm going to talk about is substance specific standards. I'm going to give you some good examples of what OSHA would consider as substance specific, but please remember this is not an exhaustive list. There's a few more on that toxic and hazardous substance list that you could consult. And the reason that it's important to talk about this is because OSHA has set permissible exposure limits for everything that I'm about to talk about, but keep in mind there also might be an action level. And so once you do your analysis and you get your air sample, what does that data mean? Are you reaching the OSHA permissible exposure limit, or are you reaching a lesser amount that would trigger you to do a few things? And so we're going to talk about some of this as we get into the next few slides regarding substance specific standards. Jennifer. So as I'm working through these, you'll notice on the top of the chain here, we discuss air monitoring. So with any of these toxic and hazardous substances, your due diligence is to do an air sample to figure out what your employees are exposed to. It's kind of like grabbing a baseline just to see. And if you're below exposure, that's great. It's kind of like your golden ticket. But if you're above exposure, there might be a few things that your company has to do to then protect your employees from the illness or disease that could come about. And so with all of these standards that we talk about, there's kind of a cyclical motion here. You're going to do some air monitoring to gather your data, but then based on that data, think about how you can control that. Go back to how Chris discussed engineering controls and admin controls. What is the best way for you to control that exposure so that your employees don't get sick? And then based on whatever these standards are, or based on whatever your air sampling results look like, you may be having to offer medical surveillance to ensure that your employees aren't becoming ill or sick because of this potential exposure. And with everything, there's always going to be record keeping and paperwork, but keep in mind, whenever there is a medical surveillance that is needed, paperwork now needs to be kept for about 30 years. So how is your company doing? Are you hanging on to that paperwork and that record keeping for years to come? And then always with anything else, there's going to be specific training involved on what this hazardous substance is before your employee even has to work with it. Jennifer, next slide. So I'm going to give you Yep, go ahead.
I have a question for you about how do you decide what areas need to be tested in a large facility with multiple buildings?
So this is something that is assessment worthy. Sometimes this is where you reach out to OECS to come in and help with that. But a couple of things that would clue you off are those signs that we talked about a little bit earlier. If you've got anything that hangs in the air, or if you've got an accumulation of any kind of a substance on equipment, smells, if you've got employees that are commenting on certain parts of their health, those are the first areas that you want to assess. But again, it might be shop wide, depending on what kind of hazards you have. And again, going back to those safety data sheets and looking to see what the hazard is that's associated with those chemicals. So there's a few things involved in here when you're getting into the assessment piece. That's a great question. And again, I want to kind of highlight if you do put something in the chat and you need more information, we do have your emails. When you put something in the chat, we can reach back out again and help decipher some of this information because it can be kind of heavy. So good question. Thank you, Jennifer. I can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so again, remember, this is just a handful of these substance-specific standards. Hexavalent chromium is one of them. So what is this? Well, hexavalent chromium would tip you off if your employees are working with stainless steel. So anytime you're basically disturbing the stainless steel, if you're doing any kind of hot work where you're welding, grinding, cutting on anything that's stainless steel, this product is a known cancer causer. And so you want to make sure that you're getting on your assessment portion of this to figure out what exposure would look like. And then based on that data, what do you do next to control that? And then quite possibly into the medical surveillance, depending on what your data looks like here. Next slide. Asbestos is still in our world, though we try to do what we can to get rid of and eliminate and not have asbestos working its way into our environment. A lot of our construction companies still come into contact with asbestos. It's mineral fibers that once the route of entry, right? Go back to that. Once your employees breathe these fibers in, it's another known carcinogen, cancer, right? Chronic lung disease, other lung cancers. So we're trying to minimize this. There's lots of standards built around asbestos. So if you've got construction companies that get into any of this kind of exposure, you definitely want to ask more questions. We not too long ago had a company that bumped into some heating. You still see some of the pipes wrapped in asbestos types of products. And this company disturbed something that was wrapped around their heating pipes. And so they got concerned. They said, do we have asbestos in here? So they actually sent a bulk sample of what they thought was asbestos in to be analyzed. And it turned out it was not asbestos. But how do you know? Right? A lot of this stuff Chris and I talk about, you can't guess. Like you have to get something sent in and get the data on it so that you know how to move forward. Next slide, please. Silica. Lots of you in here today might deal with this. So not just our construction companies. What is silica? Usually if I'm presenting this live, I ask that question, what is silica? And it basically, people will shout out, it's dust. Okay, that's great, but take it a little bit further. What's in that dust? Well, silica is really anything that originally came from the Earth's core. So if we have dirt and dust and rocks, and it's made into a product, and now you disturb that product, you might be looking at forms of silica. And to take this a little further, what this means is if you've got employees that are breathing this dust, it's equivalent to little tiny glass shards tucking their way down in your lungs. And now we might have a chronic exposure down the road. But this, again, it's not just concrete work. I have companies that work with drywall. Dust from drywall. I have companies that grind on glass. I mean, sometimes you have to take it a little bit further and think about what the exposure would be here related to dust or fumes or anything in your work environment. Next slide, please. Keep in mind, still on substance-specific standards, so OSHA does have a lot of guidance on these. If you recognize any of this and you haven't really done anything to assess or get a baseline, we have some work to do. Lead is still in our environment. Lead is known to cause lead poisoning, like kidney disease and things like that come about from this. But if you're somebody that is still producing or produces anything on the manufacturing side, if you're working with lead at all, OSHA-based standard specific that you want to ask some questions and get some samples for. Next slide. I think we have a couple more in here. So we talked a little bit about welding and grinding and cutting on stainless steel, but if that takes you out of that element, you still have people that are doing welding activities. Just because you're welding on mild steel doesn't mean you're out of the woods. So there might be products, things coming off of the hot work portion, combining with heavy metals or different exposure that comes off of your welding media. It's a good idea. If you've never gotten a sample, get your baseline, come in and do some sampling just to figure out what is in that area and then how you can do the control measures that Chris talked about earlier to take this exposure out of your employees' world. Next slide. And I think last but not least on this list, and remember, it's not an exhaustive list, but just to give you some good indicators of what to look for. If you've got employees that are working in confined spaces, we start talking about toxic and hazardous atmospheres. So first, if you're working in a confined space, hopefully you're following the process. And if you've maybe thought about using a gas monitor, gas monitor usually, to check to see what the toxic atmosphere that's already in that space before your employees get in there. But then you also have to think a little bit further. If there's nothing in there right now when you begin your work, what kind of a toxic atmosphere is being created just because of the process or the work that's going on in that space? You might be depleting your oxygen. You might be creating carbon monoxide. You might be creating an explosive environment, but you don't know that unless you do any kind of an air test or air sample to figure out what's in there. Next slide, please. And I think we have Chris up to talk to you about biological hazards.
Yes, we do. Just switching gears. So along with other hazards, you have to be aware of biological hazards and how to control those. Whether you're working indoors or outdoors, you could have contaminated soil or water. There's always an exposure to bloodborne pathogens, whether it be HIV, hepatitis B, or hepatitis C. We need to be aware of that as well. And then, some things that we can't necessarily see, bacteria, viruses, and mold, those could be present, especially during cold and flu season. But outdoors, poisonous plants like poison oak or poison ivy would be an example there. And then any exposure to animals and insects, those animals and insects could be carrying disease as well. So just some different things to think about. When we look at bloodborne pathogens specifically, go ahead to the next slide, Jennifer. We want to practice what's called universal precautions. So we want to treat all blood and other potentially infectious material that we might come across as being infected, where we could contract a bloodborne pathogen, like I said earlier, hepatitis B or C, especially amongst the occupational exposure, where we may have healthcare workers or janitorial staff that could come in contact with a bloodborne pathogen, where they would be offered a hepatitis B vaccine. I'll just be an example of that. But other things we can do is make sure we're practicing good personal hygiene and first aid. We're keeping up with our vaccines, and then also make sure we've got the right PPE on when we're cleaning up a potential spill. Next slide, please. All right, we're going to shift gears here a little bit. We'll talk about temperature, radiation, noise, and vibration. Just a few examples of some physical hazards that you could come across in the workplace. And on temperature, next slide, please. We're going to talk about hot and cold temperatures for workers, whether you're working indoors or outdoors. For hot temperatures, we want to protect our workers. We could contract a heat-related illness like heat exhaustion or heat stroke if we don't have the correct engineering, administrative, and PPE controls in place. So we have to think systematically here. So going back to the hierarchy of controls, we want to put things in place beforehand, like air conditioning, cooling fans, or local exhaust ventilation, to make sure that our workers are comfortable in a hot environment. And same thing administratively. You'll see a common theme here, but adjusting work rest cycles, climatization, making sure that workers get used to that heat before working in it. And another good thing, rotating jobs, adjusting work schedules during the hottest, to avoid the hottest times of the day would just be a couple examples there. And PPE, again, as a last resort, we want to make sure that the clothing that our employees are wearing, whether they're indoors or outdoors, something that keeps them cool, moisture wicking fabrics, something that doesn't inhibit our body's cooling capabilities. Moving on to cold temperatures, same exact thing. We as Minnesotans, upper Midwesterners, we can acclimate to cold weather pretty easily, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we're providing heated areas, shelter from the wind, and then the same thing with administrative controls, adjusting those work schedules, taking breaks in warm areas are a couple examples there. PPE is a little bit more intense here on cold temperatures, wearing layered clothing. It's easier to add clothing versus remove it, but keeping our workers dry and warm is really the whole thing here, especially fabrics that retain insulation even when wet, and using materials that insulate and waterproof. Next slide, please. All right, radiation. It's another physical hazard. Again, we want to use the hierarchy of controls here. If there's any radiation producing equipment that you may use out on the shop floor, there's many different kinds, but hopefully it's pre-engineered where we're going to be able to shield workers right before we even install the equipment. Hopefully those engineering controls are already in place. Now, there's some things you can do afterwards to make it more robust to protect individuals, but hopefully it did come from the factory where we can reduce that radiation exposure. Same thing administrative wise, minimizing our exposure times, increasing the distance away from a particular machine that might produce radiation. When going back to my early military days in the Air Force, I was an avionics technician, and one of the systems that we worked on was called the Radar Threat Warning System, and it was a system that emitted radio frequency radiation. And what we had to do is when we were troubleshooting the system or testing it, we had to isolate that aircraft and put cones out at a certain distance and notify individuals in the air so that trucks and people weren't walking through that area. So that's just an example of protection from radiation. Next slide, please. Same thing with vibration. Vibration reduction equipment. An example here, maybe we're working with a jackhammer, that vibrates, right? So we want to make sure that we really focus here on administrative controls and job rotation. We don't want somebody working on a piece of equipment that vibrates for extended periods of time. You don't want somebody on a jackhammer for 8 hours. Maybe we think about switch out every hour, or just limit the duration of that task completely. Next slide, please. And then noise. This is a big one. We want to make sure that we reduce the noise levels the best we can through the engineering, administrative, and PPE. Trying to avoid PPE altogether here. If we're above an action level for noise, we may be forced into wearing PPE. But if you handle the engineering administrative steps first, hopefully you get to that point. And if you remember, isolating or enclosing equipment, the sawmill example, the air compressor using the acoustic paneling, all great options. And again, there's many different things you should consider prior to jumping to PPE. When I was out on the flight line around jet engines, there wasn't a whole lot you could do. So we had mandatory double hearing protection where we had to wear earplugs and earmuffs because an F-16 engine at full throttle can get up to 170 decibels. So if we have the right PPE for that, with the right noise reduction, we can greatly reduce our exposure to noise.
Chris, we had a question about employees wanting to use noise canceling headphones, but then
Oh,
they're
great question.
Bluetooth and using music. And then another question just about earmuffs and if there's any disadvantages to a particular type of PPE.
That's a great question. I get that a lot, actually. If you have noise canceling headphones, whether they are the over the ear type or the inside the ear type, you have to check to see if they have a noise reduction rating. Many of them don't, and if they do, it's probably just a maybe single digit decibel levels where you think you're protected, but actually those sound pressure levels are still there where it can cause damage. Even though it cancels that noise out, you might not be protected. There are some options that I've seen through 3M and some other companies where they offer a legitimate noise reduction rating, maybe in the 20 or 30 decibel range that you could use in place of something that you'd buy off the shelf from a retailer. Earmuffs are, going back to the types, earplugs and earmuffs. We just have to make sure that they're worn appropriately. I would say earmuffs are the better solution because now we're not inserting the earplugs. A lot of people do it incorrectly. So if you can handle wearing earmuffs throughout the day, those are probably the better option over earplugs.
And then one last question about hearing protection. How do you make sure people are aware of emergencies, especially in loud environments when they're actually wearing hearing protection? I think about your example of the jets. Like if there was something going on, how would you guys have been notified about it?
That's a great question too. You're pretty much reliant on your eyes at that point. In the military, I know we used occasionally we would use um, communication walkie-talkies, that sort of thing, where you could put an earbud in and still hear the if there was an emergency that we'd be able to communicate. But otherwise, if you don't have that capability to communicate through the ears, we definitely want to make sure that we communicate visually with folks, and that means getting in front of them and waving people down would be an example there.
I've seen this out on shop floors quite a bit, Chris. It's usually not the hearing protection that lessens that you can hear emergencies. I've had a tougher time with employees listening to music in those buds, and then they can't hear anything. So more often, if it's hearing protection that is mandatory, you're still able to hear a lot of the things that are going on around you,
Sure.
depending on what the noise level is. So good recommendations. A lot of our companies are really trying to move away from any kind of music buds or anything like that out on the shop floor just because of hearing loss and the emergency factor, like
Yeah.
was just asked. So thank you. Good
Perfect.
information.
Great questions though. Thanks, Jennifer.
Yep. Next slide. All right, Chris and I are getting ready to round this presentation out for you. We're going to close out with ergonomic hazards and controls. So this has everything to do with how your employee is moving their body. You see things like sitting posture enters in, standing posture even. How is your desk set up? Is your eyesight or your eye alignment where it should be so that you're not cranking your neck in different positions? How about keyboard? How about employees that have to stand on concrete floors all day? So lots to consider under ergonomic. Jennifer, next slide, please. You might have heard terms like MSDs, musculoskeletal disorders, or sometimes we call these soft tissue injuries. And look at the bullet point here. Most work-related MSDs are among the most frequently reported cause of lost or restricted work. I call this the gift that keeps on giving because they never really go away or get better. They tend to flare up a little bit down the road. And I tell you, surgery is not always the fix. A lot of these workers' risk comes from repetition of work. Are they doing the same thing over and over and over again? And then you add high force. Depends on how they're moving their body. Are they pushing or pulling? Or are they, because of the work positioning, are they forced to be in awkward positions for a lot of their day? Next slide, Jennifer. Some of the risk factors that we talk about here, again, I mentioned a couple: overexertion, repetition, long periods of sitting or standing. Do you have breaks? Can you stretch? Chris talked about vibration of tools. There's lots now in our world that can be done with reducing the vibration of tools so that people don't end up with different hand and nerve disease. Prolonged grip or duration of sometimes they lose their grip strength. All of these are under the umbrella of risk factors for soft tissue injuries. And so there's a lot of work that has progressed under this ergonomic umbrella. Some of you may be the old school in thinking about REBA and RULA and doing some kind of a paper pencil assessment to assess positions that your employees' bodies are in. But progress a little bit. AI is kind of the new hot fashion here for us to use. And we've got different tools and techniques to come in and actually assess your employee work. And based on that AI tool, it will show us your employees' danger zones depending on what their tasks are. So lots is going on in the world of AI to help assess what your risk factors are for your employees so that you don't end up with one of these on your OSHA 300 log. Like I said, it's the gift that keeps on giving. Next slide, please. So as we round out and finish, we almost get to just go all the way back to the way that Chris and I started presenting. What is industrial hygiene? It's the science and art of anticipating what kind of hazards, what kind of processes you have on your shop floor or in your work environment, and then recognizing what some of those hazards can be through assessment, and then evaluating. Get your hard data, get your baseline, figure out what your employees are exposed to, and then you can figure out best how to control any of those hazards from becoming injury or illness or disease or any of that for your employees. Jennifer, any questions that you can think of that hadn't been addressed? Anything else that we can guide you with? And if I'll check the chat afterwards if there's any question that we didn't get to, I can check in with you and see if you got a good answer on that. Anything else, Jennifer, on your end in chat?
No, I think we've covered everything that people have asked. A lot of questions about noise and the emergencies, but I think we've covered all the questions so far. But if anyone else wants to drop anything in the chat, we're still looking at those and able to answer. We've got Chris and Donna here for a few more minutes.
Good.
Yeah, but as we start to wrap up, and if people have any more questions, I'm going to launch our poll here. I'm just giving us tell us how we did. Let us know what you thought of this webinar. We appreciate your feedback. It helps us deliver more webinars and refine what kind of information we're giving to you guys and what you'd like to hear. So please let us know that. I'll go to this next slide here. As Donna mentioned, go ahead, Donna.
No, I was going to say thank you, Jennifer. That's good reminder and good feedback from any participants on what we can offer differently or offer better. So thank you for your input on that. Chris and I have our information up. If you have further questions, or if you take some of this information back to your team and you think about different ways of getting in and assessing and evaluating this, please feel free to reach out to either Chris or I. If you already have an OECS safety associate that you work with, reach out to them. We are their pathway to getting answers for you. So our information is there for you. And again, before Jennifer finishes up, Chris and I want to thank you all for joining us today. And hopefully we've helped answer a few questions or point you in the right direction.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks, Chris and Donna. We're very happy to have you on our team and be able to present this information for us. As Donna said, please reach out to them or your OECS associate if you have any additional questions. I do just want to let everyone know we do have another webinar coming up in November, digging more specifically into essential ergonomic strategies for a healthier workplace. So as Donna was ending our webinar on ergonomic issues, we're going to have a specific webinar dealing and digging into how do we help address that, assess those things. So tune in for that. You can register, I think, already on our website. Check that out and watch for emails on that coming up soon. And then just reiterating again, OECS, we are your total safety solution. Our number one goal is to help employees return safely each day. And that is a lot of different topics that we want to dig into to help people get home. So if you have any questions at all, please reach out to our Twin Cities office or our Fargo office, and we're happy to help make sure that we're getting people home every single day. And then with that, I do want to really thank our partners helping us do that, helping us get information out about safety. So thank you once again to TSSA, MPMA, SCSA, BIA of the Red River Valley, ABC, NRAS, Build Connection, and our Lakes Area Manufacturers Alliance. So with that, that's all we've got today. We do and will have this webinar on our website here by the end of the week. And if you want any continuing education units, please look for your email. We'll be helping provide a pathway to those CEUs. But Donna, Chris, anything else you'd like to say to wrap it up?
No,
Thank
thanks
you.
to everybody that attended today. And if we can help you out in the future, please get a hold of us and we'll give you a hand.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
you, everybody.
Yep. Thank you. And yeah, CEUs will be sending emails out for assessment and evaluation and getting you your certificate. So watch for that in your emails tomorrow. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Great.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yes. Thanks,
Thank
Donna.
you.
Thanks, Chris.